All right, so today Peter Vitousek of Stanford University will be presenting his research on Pacific Islands as models for understanding social and environmental systems. His research is being done through a permit with the HETF. Please note that permits are required when entering the HETF for research purposes. Peter, you can start whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give an island-based model system perspective on soils and ecosystems and their implications for the sustainability of social environmental systems. I was born and grew up in Hawaii, and for the past 30 plus years have done most of my research here in Hawaii, most recently also on other Pacific Islands. Working in Hawaii is rewarding for many reasons, not all of them scientific. Scientifically, I think it's particularly a great place to work because islands are such wonderful model systems for understanding aspects of how the whole world works. And Hawaii is particularly good in that regard. I use model systems in the sense that physiologists and molecular biologists do. It's not just a fancy way of saying example. There are two senses in which they use the term. This is the earliest one I've found by Crow in 1929. Which I paraphrase here as, for many questions, there'll be a system or some few systems that facilitate answering the question. In developmental and molecular biology, this is another sense of model system for people who study the nematode C. elegans. As they point out, it exhibits all of the properties of multicellular organisms, but it's only a millimeter long, can be grown as a microorganism, and all 959 of its cells are readily visible. It thus provides the researcher with an ideal compromise between complexity and tractability. And I believe that work in Hawaii offers an ideal compromise between complexity and tractability, and does so for many questions. I think it's true that it's been true for evolution and the formation of new species, at least since Darwin wrote about feeling near both in space and time to that great fact, that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on the earth. And that was when he visited the Galapagos. And of course he felt near because he was near, because you could see the process of the formation of new species in the middle. And I think island soils and ecosystems are valuable in this sense of model system. They're simple in important ways, but variable and organized in others, yielding a great compromise between complexity and tractability. They're complex enough to be real and interesting, and tractable enough to be comprehensible. You know, I think that islands are good model systems for all kinds of areas of study in ecology. I'll not talk about evolution and the origin of species here, but I will talk about the formation and structure and dynamics of soils and ecosystems and the development and sustainability of human societies. This sort of shows my notion of why Hawaii is valuable. We have all basaltic parent material, relatively low diversity for its latitude, and shield volcanic topography, which means that there's very little variation in topography on coarse spatial scales from very dry to very wet sites. On the other hand, there are some very long and continuous soil gradients that are useful for study, but they're very well defined. If we're interested in substrate ages, we can work across the archipelago, and there are also spectacular rainfall gradients within Hawaii. I think Hawaii is also useful in the sense of having special features that make it convenient to study in Hawaii. I'm interested in the question, what's the source of nutrients that supports soil fertility and plant productivity in the long term as you go from hot rock to ancient soils? And in Hawaii, the three major sources of nutrients have distinct tracers that you can use for their sources. weathering of basaltic rock you can get at using element to niobium ratios. You can differentiate nutrients that come from the ocean using strontium 87 to 86 ratios. And you can also differentiate elements that come from continental crust using the ratio of neodymium 183 to neodymium 184. So we've used these systems to understand aspects of how nutrient supply varies in the long term. In long-term soil development, the source of nutrient supply changes from rock to rain, which is, in rain, you mostly have nutrients that come from marine aerosol. In younger dry soils, most of the nutrients come from the breakdown of rock, of the underlying basalt of the Hawaiian Islands. In wetter sites, those soils are depleted of most rock-derived nutrients by a few tens of thousands of years. And thereafter, most nutrients, though not phosphorus, are derived ultimately from marine aerosol, from the surrounding ocean. Not phosphorus, because phosphorus is so depleted in the surface ocean. And phosphorus from basalt lasts longer, which is a good thing because there's so little of it in rain. However, in wet sites, by 2 million years or so, most of the phosphorus from rock has been lost. Thereafter, it's the trickle of dust blown in from Asia that's the most important source of phosphorus to Hawaiian forests on geomorphically stable surfaces. This dust is something interesting because I think it's a general phenomenon. The Amazon in particular gets more dust from the Sahara than Hawaii gets from the Taklamakan Desert in Western Asia. Moreover, I think that the importance of dust illustrates the value of model systems very well. This shows the change in nutrient sources for calcium and for phosphorus. You can see in the top panel here, calcium inputs decline over the course of ecosystem development. You can see on the bottom axis is the time scale, which is on a log scale. So we have million-year-old surfaces that we can compare with surfaces that are less than 1,000 years old. And across that sequence, from Kilauea to Kauai, calcium inputs decline by about a factor of 100. However, phosphorus inputs decline by a factor of about 1,000 over the same range. And if you look at the sources of calcium, it's mostly the breakdown of basaltic rock in young sites, but then it transitions to being mostly derived from rain in older sites. Phosphorus, you can see that there's very little from rain, and the phosphorus from basalt weathering lasts longer. But by the time you get to stable surfaces on Kauai, the majority of phosphorus comes in long-distance transport of continental dust from Asia. Thousands of kilometers and generally thousands of years in the past as well. This shows a dust storm on its way from the Amazon across the Atlantic Ocean to, it's coming from the Sahara to the Amazon. And the Amazon's the great repository of ancient soils in wet climates on Earth, but it gets more dust from Africa, from the Sahara Desert, than Hawaii gets from the Taklamakan. And I think that it's generally true that rainforests on ancient soils in tropical environments get most of their phosphorus from dust that blows hundreds or thousands of kilometers from arid or semi-arid systems upwind. And I think this shows the value of Hawaii as a model, because you can understand the process in Hawaii really well, how much dust is coming in and how important it is to the functioning of forests. You can't apply the same rates, the same coefficients to Hawaii as you can apply to everywhere else, but you can apply the same process. You can understand the process well in Hawaii, and you can apply that understanding to other systems. And that's what the research community has done. And that's how we know that the Amazon is dependent on the Sahara Desert for its phosphorus in the long term. Second, if we look at, that was just what I was just saying. If we look at a rainfall gradient, we can see that soils don't change gradually with a gradual change in environmental forcing. Rather, their variation is characterized by thresholds and what I'll call soil process domains. Thresholds occur where there's a rapid or nonlinear change in soil properties in a brief interval along a long continuous gradient of environmental forcing. In Hawaii, that's either rainfall or soil age. Soil process domains represent the areas between thresholds, where soil properties change relatively little across a wide range in forcing along a continuous gradient. And we've worked on these in Kohala. This is a transect across leeward Kohala. On the wet end, it receives about 3,300 millimeters of rain a year. On the dry end, it receives about 280 millimeters of rain a year. But it's all on the same substrate across that entire range of rainfall. And so we can understand if variation in soil properties emerges along that gradient, we know it's not because of anything but internal dynamics to soils. This was the first pedogenic threshold described. It was by my colleague Oliver Chadwick at Santa Barbara, who was sampling soils across leeward Kohala, and he showed that there's a very distinctive threshold at around 1,500 millimeters of rainfall, or a little more a year, or a little less a year. And the reason it's there is that the yellow line here shows the breakdown of underlying rock. You can see that the breakdown of rock weathering occurs and increases linearly with increases in rainfall up to the point where all of the rock that can be broken down has been exhausted. At that point, of course, weathering drops off to very low levels and the soils become very infertile. And this threshold here, as do many of them, represents a change in source of nutrients from rock as the main source to rain, marine aerosol as the main source of nutrients across this environmental gradient. So now I'm going to go to human societies. The opportunity to work with both anthropologists and Native Hawaiian scholars has pulled me beyond soils and biogeochemistry into their interactions with human societies and their sustainability. Some anthropologists have also long had model systems perspective, which is expressed here by Patrick Kirch, who's also from Hawaii, in a book he wrote in 2000 about the peopling of the Pacific. And he wrote, "In the Pacific, history's given us an unparalleled opportunity to compare what literally hundreds of societies have wrought, at times in highly similar environments, at times in strikingly different ones. It's not only the range of environmental variation among isolated Pacific islands, but also the demonstrable fact that many societies had common origins that renders them such marvelous microcosms, such wonderful natural and cultural experiments of history." The people that Kirch is referring to here that have common origins are the Polynesian people who deliberately navigated the Pacific in double-hulled sailing canoes from about 800 to about 3,000 years ago and discovered essentially all of the habitable islands over a vast area of the Pacific. Can illustrate some of the variation among the islands that they discovered relatively straightforwardly. Hawaii is a relatively large archipelago, which is volcanic with some fertile soils and well-watered stream valleys. In contrast, Rapa Nui or Easter Island is also volcanic, but it's small, about 1/100th the size of Hawaii, and the soils are relatively infertile there. Hikuera in the Tuamotus is tiny, 25 kilometers squared. It's a coral atoll with few terrestrial, but relatively abundant marine resources. Then when you go to the area that has most of the land in Polynesia, which is Aotearoa, it's nearly 90% of the total land area of Polynesia. It's huge, subcontinental, so-called temperate in climate, which means it's freezing part of the year and too hot part of the year. And Polynesian crops would not grow on much of the South Island here. So the people had to follow a very different way of living. These islands and many more were discovered and settled by Polynesians with a distinctive culture, set of ideas, and a suite of plants and animals that they transported to their islands in their sailing canoes. Their societies evolved in these very different islands, in part in response to features of the particular islands they discovered, which is obvious in the case of Aotearoa or New Zealand, but is true everywhere across the Pacific. Because they're the same people with the same plants and animals and same ideas about how to use them, you can see that what had worked in their past or worked on one of these islands wouldn't work everywhere. So they had to adapt to survive. And that adaptation is grounded in soils and ecosystems, and so is traceable. I recognize clearly that terms like model system are academic impositions on an indigenous process. But my friends who are Native Hawaiian scholars in Kupuna put a very similar question, somewhat differently. Their question is, when and how did Hawaiians become Hawaiian? Their answer that it happened when their interactions with the lands of Hawaii altered their culture from that of their ancestors, from Polynesian to distinctively Hawaiian, maps well onto academic discussions like this one. And the question of how that happened, I think, is very much the same question. So in summary, I think islands are useful for understanding land-environment interactions because the people on them have common origins, and they brought with them their culture and their plants and animals as they traveled. They're very well characterized and highly distinctive lands. So there are features of the lands that make them more comprehensible than most lands are understandable, just as there are features of the society that make them more understandable than most societies are understandable. And so when each of them alone is more understandable, their interactions are much more comprehensible. These lands were discovered and occupied relatively recently. So in many cases, the way that societies have evolved over time is traceable in a way that it's not in many places. These were isolated island societies, not completely isolated by any means, but more so than continental societies ever are or were. So internal dynamics were relatively stronger than interactions with other societies for island societies. Another important point is that these were dynamic and innovative societies that diverged in land use and social structure, and that, at least in Hawaii, evolved into socially and culturally complex nations. Because they are so dynamic and innovative, they can give you a sense of what's possible for humans to do. Finally, and crucially, they're living cultures that contribute to the process of discovery and understanding. You know, the evolution of cultures that this makes feasible is fascinating, but I'm a simple biogeochemist. I need something more concrete that I can work on. So I've focused on agriculture. And that's a particularly useful place to focus because Polynesian and Hawaiian in particular agriculture is interesting because, like everywhere, agriculture is a crucial and perhaps the most crucial nexus between ecosystems and human societies. It's also interesting that many Polynesian societies developed intensive agriculture with high populations and socially and culturally complex social systems And the Hawaiians in particular were great farmers, intensifying agriculture by very different pathways in the very different lands that they farmed, and supporting populations greater than the modern populations on most islands in the archipelago. The biggest contrast in agricultural forms was between irrigated taro systems versus rain-fed sweet potato and other crops, which were, the latter was practiced especially on the island of Hawaii. And so we know that intensive upland agriculture can damage the productive capacities of lands. And so my question here is, how did Polynesians meet the sustainability challenges that the fact that land is damaged by intensive agriculture poses for them? I should say here that I think it's well recognized now that Polynesian people were the greatest navigators of the era in their great era of discovery across the Pacific. But there are ways that they also were the greatest farmers on Earth in the same time by their development of intensive agricultural production systems in climates in which most people in the world practice shifting cultivation or slash and burn agriculture. They developed intensive production systems in many environments where people in continents typically didn't develop those intensive production systems. And so it's reasonable to ask where and how were those intensive production systems sustained? Started this work by looking in Kohala on the island of Hawaii, which is the oldest part of the island of Hawaii, where the rainfall gradient I showed earlier is found. This area supports irrigated agriculture in windward valleys. And these systems of irrigated agriculture, loʻi persisted through the disruptions of colonizations and the colonization and the devastation of introduced disease. And there's some continuity and traditional knowledge of taro cultivation that's maintained through that time. Kohala also supported a rain-fed system of more than 60 kilometers squared, more than 25 square miles, which was a remarkably intensive system. This shows the field walls that are the remains of that system running across the slope on leeward Kohala. And this is a LiDAR image that shows the system was made up of these field walls and paved trails that ran from Mauka to Makai that knit the system together. The system was remarkably intensive, as LiDAR shows, but with disease and disruption caused by colonization, it disappeared about 150 years ago, and much of it has been lost to memory and practice. Local people don't know of the existence of this system, which has been hidden away behind locked ranch gates for over a century in most cases. Not surprisingly, when we studied this system, we found that the rain-fed agricultural system occupied a fertile domain of soils where ongoing weathering could renew nutrients. And indeed, it was our interest in understanding these agricultural systems that caused us to do the detailed sampling that defined pedogenic thresholds and soil process domains across this landscape. The shaded area here shows the zone covered by the intensive agricultural system, and you can see that that system has features that make it particularly suitable. Resin phosphorus and exchangeable calcium in the bottom panel here for intensive agriculture. This domain of intensive agriculture, which we also call a sweet spot because it is has ideal conditions for intensive agriculture. Oops, that was one more slide that I meant to advance. occupied that sweet spot with enough rainfall to support intensive cropping, but not so much rainfall that soil fertility had been depleted through millennia of water moving through the soil. That sweet spot represents a domain of soil properties where rock weathering is ongoing and past biological uplift of the forest that preceded the agricultural systems here enriched the surface soil. That sweet spot supporting rain-fed agriculture dwindles and ultimately disappears with continued soil development. On older islands in the archipelago, especially Kauai and Oahu, there's no geomorphologically stable surface that's both wet enough and fertile enough for intensive agriculture. And these rain-fed systems provided most of the staple food for the large, young, and politically dynamic island of Hawaii. And the society that developed and was supported by rain-fed agriculture differed from that on the older islands that were sustained by irrigated systems. The islands, which were independent nations that were supported by these different systems, were in conflict, and oral histories of the couple of centuries before contact show that the dynamism or aggression came from the young islands in the archipelago, especially from the island of Hawaii. You can understand why this could happen when you look at the yields on the different agricultural systems. Before I go there, I'm going to show a map of the distribution of potential rain-fed and irrigated systems on different islands in the archipelago. Sam Gunn, with the Nature Conservancy of Hawaii, mapped the irrigated systems, the Loikalo, and Thane Latafoga, an archaeologist at the University of Auckland, did the lead in mapping the rain-fed systems. Rain-fed systems are shown in red here. You can see that the island of Hawaii is almost completely dominated by rain-fed systems with only small amounts of Loikalo. And the island of Kauai is almost completely dominated by Loikalo with essentially no rain-fed systems in it at all. If you look at the land available for agriculture, the labor required to produce, and the yield that could be produced, you can see what made the island of Hawaii vulnerable and what likely made it the aggressor in inter-island warfare in the era of pre-contact. The intensive agricultural area on the island of Hawaii was large relative to that on Kauai, because Hawaii is large relative to Kauai. It's about 10 times more suitable land for intensive agriculture on the island of Hawaii than there is on Kauai. But of that land, only about 3% of the agricultural area of the island of Hawaii was irrigated versus 100% of Kauai. The irrigated lands, the Loikalo, produce more and require less labor than do the rain-fed field systems. So you can see the total yields in tons on the island of Hawaii were only about 3.5 times that of Kauai, even though Hawaii had 10 times more agricultural area. Finally, if you look at the ability to produce a surplus, the yield of agricultural products per unit of labor per person in these systems, you can see that it required something like a little over 150,000 people to produce 180,000 tons of staple crop on the island of Hawaii. It only required about less than 10,000 people to produce nearly 50,000 tons of staple crop on the island of Kauai. So the ability to produce a surplus was much greater on Kauai. And of course, if you have a surplus, you can support roles in society other than farmer, priest, ali'i, warrior, artist, which which were more difficult to support on the island of Hawaii than on the island of Kauai. There are some implications of this for population. One thing that jumps out at you from this is that the labor required just to farm on the island of Hawaii was about 80% of the modern population of the island of Hawaii. And the population of the island of Hawaii before European contact was greater than the population of the island of Hawaii now. That was true for most of the islands in the archipelago, with the exception of Oahu. You couldn't have a city like Honolulu with a Hawaiian economy, but you could have a dispersed population like you have on all the other islands now in the archipelago. And these people were supported, this larger number of people were supported entirely from local resources, with no import of food, no fossil fuels, no industrial fertilizer, not even any draft animals, completely by human labor. So it was a very different system that we know was sustained for a couple of centuries before European contact. You know, Hawaiian populations reached something like their peak a couple of hundred years before contact and were sustained there for a couple of hundred years until the arrival of Europeans in the late 1700s. So what can we learn about the ways these societies lived? We've taken this analysis to other islands, notably to Rapa Nui. And Rapa Nui is a small volcanic island which is much less fertile than Hawaii. Rapa Nui people adapted to this low fertility with rock gardens they created. This is an example in the foreground of one such rock garden. When I took this picture, I was standing on a rock outcrop, and you can see a rock garden below this outcrop that I was standing on, and then an area that doesn't have a lot of rocks on the surface until you approach another outcrop of rock and a rock garden there at the base of that other outcrop of rock. We ran a transect across this area that was in the last photograph and collected soils every 3 meters along that transect. And as you can see, that in the rock gardens themselves, the soil fertility reached up into the lower margin of the soil fertility of the intensive Hawaiian rain-fed field systems. It was below that threshold of fertility in the area between rock gardens and on the outcrops themselves. So the matrix of the land was infertile, too infertile for intensive agriculture, but they were able to, through their actions, increase soil fertility to be marginally okay in the rock gardens that they maintained. This is a tiny island with very small areas that were made just fertile enough to intensify agriculture. So it was substantially constrained relative to Hawaii. From these analyses and work by colleagues Kirch, Ladefoged, and Chadwick on different islands, thought about the pathways to sustainability or not on Pacific Islands prior to European contact. And I see at least 3 pathways that were important in Polynesia before globalization smushed things out very substantially. One pathway was redesigning a production system to reduce its impact on the island, seeing that the production system was damaging the island and damaging itself so that it would be hard to maintain the production system in the long term, and redesign the production system to reduce its impact, regulate population, and keep that new system intact for centuries. That was the pathway followed on the western Polynesian outlier island of Tikopia. Another pathway is to persist in earlier practices and retrogress from a peak in population and level of social development, which I think the evidence is pretty good that occurred on Mangaya and Rapa Nui. I don't like the term collapse at all. I think that it's better to think in terms of a retrogression from a peak in these situations. A third pathway that I've become increasingly impressed by is that is in Hawaii. It's innovation, where the nations of Hawaii, were complex, populous, and highly organized societies that developed new production systems and shared them across the archipelago in the centuries before European contact. They developed new production systems when their old ones reached a limit. And by innovating new systems, they were able to innovate their way around circumstances that could have crushed their societies. You can say that ultimately that approach is not sustainable. It just makes the ultimate reckoning worse, because you're going to grow your population until you reach a nexus that you can't innovate your way around, and then you'll have a greater population and a farther distance to fall. But you can say that, but you have to recognize that it's the path that we're on as a society now. I have to say it's not necessarily a free choice which of these pathways was followed by different societies. Features of the island as well as the society could determine which pathway could be followed on that island. My final question is, can we learn anything from the experience of island societies that face the need for a transition to sustainability early and very starkly, compared to the way that modern society is facing the need to make the same transition? The systems between their production systems and the global one we work with now are different. Their technology was limited. They were of their time and place in a way that we as a society aren't. So I believe that only ways of thinking could carry over. For thinking, I think there are three features that set Polynesian societies apart and help them on their path towards sustainability. One is the long-term perspective that comes from genealogy. The second is a regard for resources, for the environment generally, as kin. And a third is that they were island societies for whom their islands were their worlds. They could see when the environment was stressed, and they could see that what was left of it was all there was or ever would be. I think it's interesting for us to think about the last of these and ask what influence it had on the first two of these, because I think we're now in a position we're the first generation to be able to see that Earth is an island. We can see Earth as an island of habitability that supports life floating in the hostile environment of space. It's an island. And we're also the first to see that our impacts loom large globally. The curve of carbon dioxide from Mauna Loa in the upper right of this figure shows that even our waste products are now looming large on a global scale. And we can see this. We can see that we're an island. We can see that we're damaging the environment of our island. Can we learn from that, like some Polynesian societies certainly did? Can we adopt some of their other practices that led towards sustainability? And can we become a more sustainable society as a consequence? Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions I can.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. That was awesome. So do any of our audience members have any questions for Peter? Well, I have a question. So you mentioned the rock gardens in Rapa Nui. I was curious, like how how do those rock gardens retain the soil fertility exactly?
Well, I think that the rocks break down and release nutrients and increase the soil fertility. I don't know if the people did that to increase soil fertility. They may have done it to stop surface evaporation of water, and which the rocks will certainly have that effect. And so it would increase the ability of crops to grow because it has a positive influence on soil water, but had the effect of increasing soil fertility as well. And that effect probably was essential to their practice. If you'd asked them, they might have said, "We're doing it for the water," not for the soil fertility. But it doesn't matter, They did it and had that effect.
Yeah, well, thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions?
I have a question. Thank you, Peter. It's so good to see you, and what an amazing audience you have online today.
It's good to see you, Mehana.
Mahalo for sharing today, and I always learn so much. And I guess I was wondering, what do you see as the really key questions to look into and the important things to continue to forward and find out more about at this stage in research on this front here in Hawaii?
Well, I think we know a lot about the fact that the rain-fed systems were important, and I think we know a lot about what they meant to Hawaiian society, but I don't think we know nearly enough yet about how they were farmed. I think we know a lot about the lo'i kalo and how they were farmed, but if we had to now rejuvenate the rain-fed system and depend on it for our living, I don't think we could do it. I think we wouldn't know as well as they knew what they were doing. And, it's asking a lot for us to know as much as they knew. But I think it's an important thing to understand as much as we can about their system and how it worked.
Here, it's Cheryl. I have a question.
Hi, Cheryl.
Thank you for your presentation. So I'm kind of curious, especially as we on the Kohala Leeward side are rain diminishing, less rainfall. So when we look at dryland field cultivation, do we have any past examples of a time where the climate, where we were suffering more drought conditions, and so we would have had irrigated dry land field systems producing those crops? Just curious what, if any of your research found anything, and as we go forward, as we have less rain on the dry land side, any thoughts to help us redeem our food from
I
here?
think that the Hawaiian systems were much more efficient in their use of water than modern systems are. And so I think that if you have a bad enough drought, it will impact anything. Doesn't matter how efficient you are. And I think there's evidence that 400 years ago, there was a very dry period in Hawaii, and that you find charcoal that dates to 400 years old in places that would not burn now. And that's probably pretty good evidence that it was a lot drier then. And there is oral history of drought and starvation. And so, I don't think in a lot of the rain-fed dryland systems, we could have irrigated them successfully. I don't think there were sources of water nearby. Have been done. But I think that as it's drying out on the leeward side now, as it is in many places in Hawaii, it becomes more important to learn how to be efficient with water. And I think the Hawaiian farmers were among the most efficient with water anywhere in the world. They were really good at doing that.
Thank you so much.
All right, do we have any other questions? No? Well, thank you so much, Peter. That was an awesome presentation. And thank you so much for everyone who joined us today. All the audience members, make sure to check your emails, fill out the feedback form, that'd be awesome. We'll also send you a link to the YouTube playlist. And if you want to sign up for next month's webinar, that'd be great. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Aloha.